If you spend enough time on Reddit or YouTube, you will eventually stumble across a story that sounds completely made up. It's usually presented as a hilarious historical footnote, the time a modern nation went to war with a flock of birds and lost. In late 1932, the Australian government deployed an active military unit into the outback. Under the command of Major G.P.W. Meredith, Royal Australian Artillery soldiers marched into the brush armed with Lewis machine guns and 10,000 rounds of ammunition. Their target? A massive flock of flightless birds. The operation immediately collapsed into a tactical nightmare. When soldiers tried mounting their heavy machine guns to the beds of military trucks, the vehicles bounced violently over the rough terrain. The gunners couldn't aim, and the birds easily sprinted out of range. The emus instinctively scattered into small, erratic groups, using their speed to stay outside the effective range of the guns. The heavy artillery jammed. After weeks of exhausting pursuit and wasting thousands of rounds to kill only a fraction of the flock, Major Meredith ordered a retreat. That is the digital myth. In 1932, the farmers begging for machine guns were actually thousands of destitute World War I veterans struggling to survive on failing land after being abandoned by their own state. Following the armistice in 1918, the Australian government faced the massive logistical challenge of reintegrating returning soldiers. Through the Soldiers' Settlement Scheme, the state handed these veterans small plots of land in Western Australia's harsh outback, expecting them to somehow carve out profitable wheat farms. By 1929, the Great Depression hit and global wheat prices collapsed. The government demanded the veterans increase their yields, promising financial subsidies to keep them afloat. Those subsidies never arrived, leaving the veterans broke and entirely dependent on a successful harvest. This map of Western Australia shows how the veterans inadvertently engineered their own crisis. To grow their wheat, they cleared vast stretches of native bushland and installed thousands of artificial water troughs for livestock. They turned an arid desert into a biological oasis. That oasis perfectly aligned with the natural migration routes of the native emu. Seeking food and water after their breeding season, 20,000 starving birds marched out of the inland deserts and walked straight onto the veterans' wheat fields. The veterans had unwittingly built the perfect ecological sanctuary for the exact animal that would destroy their only source of income, setting up a collision between human economic desperation and natural survival. Facing total financial ruin, the veterans petitioned Minister of Defense George Pearce for help. Rather than offering agricultural relief or debt forgiveness, Pearce deployed the military as a political exercise to prove the government was taking action. But the military was entirely unprepared. Emus can sprint at 30 miles per hour. When startled, their flock behavior is highly decentralized, instantly breaking apart into chaotic, unpredictable paths that make group targeting impossible. Even when the soldiers did land a direct hit, the birds often kept running. Their dense plumage and heavily muscled bodies allowed them to absorb multiple bullets without suffering immediate fatal damage. Major Meredith's men were trained in the rigid trench warfare of the Western Front. Setting up stationary Lewis guns to fire into a target zone works against advancing infantry, but it fails completely against a fast, highly dispersed biological target. The government attempted to solve a biological migration with the tools of the Western Front. By treating an ecological shift like a conventional invasion, they discovered that heavy artillery is a useless metric of success against an adversary that refuses to follow the rules of human engagement. When the military retreated, the conflict didn't end. The memes usually stop at the comedic retreat, leaving out the fact that the Australian government simply shifted its strategy. Instead of a centralized strike, they armed the desperate veterans directly. This chart compares the results of the two strategies. While the military operation yielded fewer than 1,000 confirmed kills, the state-sponsored civilian bounty system resulted in over 57,000 emus slaughtered in a single 6-month period in 1934. Even that death toll failed to protect the wheat crops. Lethal force could not stop the migration. The only permanent resolution was the construction of hundreds of miles of physical containment infrastructure, massive exclusion fences stretching across the outback. The conflict ended not as a comedic military loss, but as a systematic massacre of indigenous wildlife, fueled by the government's failure to support its veterans. We prefer the comedic version because it is much easier for a culture to laugh at a bumbling military than to confront a government that abandoned its own war veterans during a global depression. The ultimate irony occurred decades later. In 1999, the Australian government passed the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act, which formally classified the wild emu as a protected species. Nations that lose wars do not typically pass federal laws protecting the opposing side. That legislation proves this was never a war. It was a symptom of a completely broken relationship with the natural world. The Great Emu War is a story where every human side lost. The government lost prestige, the military lost dignity, and the farmers lost their livelihoods. The only true victors were the emus. Through biological tenacity, they forced a nation to rethink its place in the ecosystem.